Some people who grew up in the 1970s were never socially loud. They didn't learn how to interrupt, perform, or claim attention. Not because they lacked confidence, but because the world around them didn't demand noise to survive. Homes rewarded restraint. Schools favoured order. Quiet wasn't a personality yet. It was a condition. And for many, it quietly became the way they learned to exist. The 1970s were shaped by restraint more than expression. In many households, emotions were expected to stay contained, not explored. Parents who had lived through war, economic uncertainty, or strict post-war values often prioritized stability over self-expression. What mattered was endurance, not articulation. Children learned quickly that feelings were something you managed alone. Schools reinforced this rhythm. Classrooms valued obedience, silence, and the ability to follow structure without complaint. A child who spoke too much, asked too many questions, or showed too much emotion was often labelled disruptive. Meanwhile, the quiet child blended in smoothly, causing no friction, drawing no concern. Silence was not only tolerated, it was functional. Social environments followed similar rules. Communities were smaller, expectations clearer, and roles more rigid. Standing out carried risk. Being noticeable could invite scrutiny, correction, or embarrassment. For many children, especially those sensitive by nature, the safest strategy was to stay contained. Over time, this environment taught an unspoken lesson. Expression was optional, but composure was essential. Loudness did not increase safety. Visibility did not guarantee care. Adjustment did. So quietness did not emerge as a trait chosen freely. It developed as a response to surroundings that rewarded those who could exist without demanding space. In that context, not being socially loud wasn't a weakness. It was alignment with the world as it was. Socially quiet children in the 1970s often received a specific kind of approval, the kind that came through absence. They were praised not for what they expressed, but for what they didn't require. They didn't interrupt adults. They didn't draw attention to their needs. They didn't complicate already busy lives. This form of approval was subtle but powerful, being described as easy, low maintenance, or well-behaved, reinforced the idea that silence equaled value. Attention was something given to those who caused trouble or demanded it. If you stayed quiet, you stayed safe and invisible. Over time, this shaped self-perception. Quietness stopped being something a child did, and slowly became something they were. Not speaking up felt natural. Asking for space felt unnecessary. Needs were noticed internally, not externally. What made this dynamic particularly lasting was that it was rarely questioned. No one corrected it. No one said, "You don't need to be this contained." The environment worked smoothly because of it. As a result, many carried this pattern into adulthood. They became people who functioned well without taking up room, people who listened, adapted, and waited. Not because they lacked thoughts or desires, but because they learned early that being unseen was a form of success. For children who did not grow up socially loud, visibility was never framed as a requirement. Loud children learned early how to negotiate attention, how to interrupt, how to hold space through volume and presence. Quiet children learned something different. They learned how to exist without friction. They observed social dynamics rather than shaping them. They listened carefully, tracking tone, mood, and unspoken rules. Instead of asserting themselves, they adjusted. This was not avoidance. It was efficiency. Social energy was treated as a limited resource, something to conserve rather than spend freely. In many situations, being loud offered no advantage. Adults did not reward it. Peers did not always respect it. So quiet children learned that speaking only when necessary was safer than speaking often. Silence became a form of control. By staying contained, they reduced the risk of embarrassment, correction, or misunderstanding. This pattern created a strong internal orientation. Decisions were made internally before being expressed, if they were expressed at all. The child learned to be present without being prominent. Importantly, this was not driven by fear or insecurity. It was adaptation to an environment where loudness was optional and restraint was effective. Social quietness became a strategy that worked, and therefore stayed. Not growing up socially loud often required learning emotional containment at an early age. Feelings were not ignored, but they were handled privately. Confusion, disappointment, and even excitement were processed inward, without external display. Children learned to read the room before expressing anything. They learned which emotions were acceptable to show and which were better kept inside. Over time, this sharpened emotional awareness, but it also trained the nervous system to remain inward-focused. This internal processing built resilience. These individuals became capable of enduring discomfort without immediate release. They learned patience, self-regulation, and emotional discipline. However, it also reduced the impulse to express spontaneously. Expression felt optional, even unnecessary. Instead of reaching outward for validation or comfort, they learned to stabilize themselves internally. This created a sense of self-sufficiency, but it also meant that others rarely saw the full range of what they felt. Emotional containment became automatic, not as suppression, but as habit. And habits formed early often feel like identity later, even when the environment that required them no longer exists. In many social environments of the 1970s, quietness was subtly associated with maturity. A child who remained composed, spoke selectively, and did not display excessive emotion was often seen as thoughtful or advanced for their age. Loudness, by contrast, was frequently framed as impulsive, childish, or lacking control. Children absorbed these evaluations without being aware of it. They learned that restraint carried moral weight. To be reserved felt responsible. To be expressive felt risky, even self-indulgent. Over time, this created an internal hierarchy where silence felt superior to visibility. This belief did not come from direct instruction, but from observation. The quiet child noticed who was taken seriously and who was corrected, who was trusted and who was dismissed. Composure was rewarded with respect, while emotional display was often met with discomfort or impatience. As this pattern repeated, restraint became linked to self-respect. Speaking less felt like evidence of depth. Holding back felt like intelligence. The child did not feel deprived by this. On the contrary, they felt aligned with what adulthood seemed to require. Years later, this belief often persists. Even when louder cultures dominate, the internal association remains. Being quiet feels grown, grounded, and safe, while visibility still carries the faint echo of immaturity. Many individuals shaped by this background function well in social situations. They know how to engage appropriately, respond thoughtfully, and read social cues with accuracy. They are rarely awkward or socially disconnected. Their presence is calm, regulated, and adaptable. However, they do not seek the center of attention. They do not compete for recognition or dominate conversations. Being seen is not a goal. Stability is. They are comfortable participating from the edges, contributing without asserting prominence. For them, social comfort does not require visibility. In fact, high visibility can feel unnecessary or even destabilizing. They trust consistency more than spotlight. They value smooth interaction over impression-making. This often leads others to underestimate them. Their competence is quiet, their influence is subtle. They may be overlooked in environments that reward performance over presence. Yet internally, they feel socially capable. They do not feel excluded. They simply operate with a different definition of safety and belonging, one rooted in equilibrium rather than recognition. As culture shifted in later decades, social expectations changed in ways that felt subtle but persistent. Visibility began to carry value. Confidence was increasingly measured by how openly someone could present themselves. Self-promotion, emotional display, and assertive presence became social currencies. For those who did not grow up socially loud, this shift created a quiet sense of misalignment. Not inadequacy, but difference. The rules had changed, and they had not been trained for the new game. What once felt neutral now felt like absence. They noticed that being competent was no longer enough to be recognized. Being present no longer guaranteed being seen. Silence, which once blended seamlessly into the background, now risked being interpreted as disengagement. This did not provoke rebellion. It created adjustment. Many adapted by performing loudness when required, but the effort felt unnatural and draining. Others stayed consistent with themselves, accepting that the world was moving in a direction that did not reflect their strengths. The result was often a quiet tension. They were not behind. They were simply calibrated for a different social climate, one that no longer existed. Despite external assumptions, socially quiet individuals often possess rich internal lives. They think deeply, reflect carefully, and process experiences before responding. Their attention moves inward first, not outward. They notice patterns, inconsistencies, and emotional undercurrents that louder engagement can miss. Their understanding forms quietly, through observation rather than expression. When they speak, it is often deliberate. Because their engagement is internal, others may misinterpret it. Silence can be mistaken for indifference. Restraint can be read as distance. But this reading is inaccurate. Their quiet is not emptiness. It is density. Thought, feeling, and evaluation are all present, simply not broadcast. They are involved, but not performative. This style of engagement can be powerful in the right environments, ones that value depth over display. But in louder settings, it often goes unnoticed. Understanding this difference reframes quietness not as lack of participation, but as a different mode of presence, one that operates below the surface rather than on it. When you grow up without practicing social loudness, claiming space rarely feels natural. Needs are sensed internally but often remain unspoken. Boundaries exist, but they are implied rather than asserted. Presence is steady, yet understated. Life can move forward smoothly this way. Conflict is minimized. Relationships remain stable on the surface, but over time something subtle accumulates. Opportunities pass without resistance. Recognition goes to those who know how to signal their presence. This is not because quiet individuals lack ability or insight. It is because the skill of self-assertion was never rehearsed. Speaking up can feel intrusive. Asking for more can feel unnecessary or even inappropriate. As a result, others may set the terms by default. Decisions are made around them, not with them. Their adaptability becomes invisible labor. The cost is rarely dramatic. It is quiet, gradual, and cumulative. A series of moments where space could have been claimed, but wasn't. Understanding this cost is not about regret, it is about awareness. Recognizing that silence, while once adaptive, may no longer serve in every context. Not growing up socially loud is not a deficit. It is a developmental outcome shaped by specific conditions. These individuals are not missing something essential. They were formed in environments that valued containment over expression. Quiet in this sense was inherited before it was chosen. It became a habit long before it became an identity. The key shift comes with awareness. When quietness is understood as a learned pattern, it stops being limiting. It becomes flexible. One can remain quiet by choice, not by default. This does not require becoming louder or more visible. It requires recognizing when silence is intentional and when it is automatic, when it serves and when it restricts. Awareness restores agency. It allows quiet to coexist with presence, restraint with clarity. In this way, quiet does not disappear. It matures. It becomes something owned, not inherited, a deliberate way of being rather than a silent continuation of the past.